What's up guys, Readiness Reviews here with you again, and today we're going to be going over the most antique firearms in my collection. These are going to be the 5 oldest military surplus firearms that I personally possess, and who knows, after this video, maybe you would like to add one of these awesome firearms to your collection as well. Before we get into it, please give this video a thumbs up if you like seeing military surplus centric firearms content here on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel to catch all of my future videos, and drop me a comment letting me know what the oldest rifle in your personal collection is. Now let's get right into it. We will be working backwards in this video, going from newest to oldest, and of the 5 oldest rifles in my collection, the newest is this Homburg 1892 Gewehr 88, also known as the 1888 commission rifle. This particular firearm has never been featured on the channel before. However, I have had it in the collection for a couple of years now. It usually sits right there, and some of you guys have talked about it being in the background before. The reason that it hasn't made it to the channel up until this point is that it needs some work done to it before it's really ready to get out to the range. The 1888 commission rifle was, of course, Germany's answer to the smokeless rifle question. This was the first smokeless powder firearm that Germany produced. For the time, it was a very cutting-edge design. However, it was kind of comprised of individual features that the German brass picked from other designs. The original 1888 commission rifle was loaded with Mannlicher-style clips, where the whole clip fits into the action of the rifle. It has a Schlegelmilch action, as opposed to Mauser, but it does possess some Mauser features, like the rear flip safety and bolt removal mechanism. One of the more interesting things about this rifle is the rather large barrel shroud. The barrel looks extremely thick, but this is actually a hollow tube surrounding the internal barrel. The idea was that having that airspace between the barrel and the outside shroud would help in heat dissipation. You'll see the same idea in early Belgian Mausers. This rifle was initially adopted with the Patron 1888 cartridge, which was a very early smokeless powder cartridge utilizing a round-tipped, bottle-nosed bullet. Germany produced an absolute ton of these, and leading up to the First World War and advancements in cartridge technology, they decided to undergo a conversion process, updating the rifles so they could fire more modern ammunition. And that's where we get to the features of my particular rifle here. This is actually a 1888 05. The whole purpose of that 05 conversion was to take the older 88 rifles and allow them to fire the new Spitzer cartridge of the 98K Mauser. There are 3 main types of 1888 rifles that you will come across. Some rifles will be completely unconverted. They will still have a hole in the bottom of the magazine for the Mannlicher style clip to come out of. They will not have a stripper clip bridge cut into the receiver, and they will also not have a recess cut to fit the pointed Spitzer cartridge. Those rifles will also not have an S stamp on them. There are some middle-of-the-road conversions. They will not have the extra recess cut into the receiver ring for that pointed Spitzer cartridge, and they may or may not have an S stamping. And then you have your full-on converted rifles, like this one, a true 1888 05. Of course, the magazine well has been plugged. A stripper clip guide has been ground into the receiver. It has that recess for the pointed Spitzer cartridge, and it has the S stamping on the receiver ring. My particular example here is a complete hodgepodge of parts. I don't think there are 2 matching serial numbers on this rifle, and to make things even worse, I'm pretty sure this stock was meant for an unconverted 1888 rifle because my magazine doesn't exactly work. In the process of converting these rifles over from Mannlicher style clip loading to Mauser style clip loading, there were some additional cuts done to the wood of the stock to allow the new cartridge feed mechanism to operate properly, and on this rifle, it does not. So it's essentially a single shot at the moment. You can't stick a Mannlicher clip down in there, and you can't actually load rounds into the magazine, and that's the big issue that I need to correct with this rifle. I do plan on doing that in a future video because I think that would be an interesting topic to show you guys, and it will be a learning experience for me, that's for sure. Like many 1888 rifles, this one did fall into Ottoman hands at some point because the rear sight has been remarked with Farsi. The 1888 commission rifle would go on to see extensive use in the First World War. It was meant to be a rear-line rifle for the Germans, but they saw plenty of front-line use because they were so abundant. And as I alluded to before, the Ottoman Empire ended up with a ton of these rifles that also saw plenty of service. I do have one more very sad example of an 1888 commission rifle here in the collection, and this one is actually older than the first one. This one was made at Spandau in 1890. I picked up this very broken rifle from Hunter's Lodge. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen that video. And even though it's literally broken in half, it's still an interesting piece in the collection. It is a mostly unconverted 1888, but it still has that S marking for Spitzer cartridges. Maybe one day I'll find a replacement stock and we'll get this one put back into service. But for now, it's just a big old paperweight, and I'm okay with that. Next up, we have a pretty recent acquisition of mine. This is a 1891 dated Mannlicher 1888-90 made by OEWG in Steyr, Austria. Of course, I picked this up from Royal Tiger Imports, and this rifle is in pretty darn rough condition. The bore's basically gone, the stock is pretty seriously cracked, and it has almost no finish left on it. But for the price, I can't complain too much. This rifle is essentially the progenitor of the Mannlicher 1895 rifle that the Austro-Hungarian Empire used in the First World War. Plenty of these 1888-90s saw use in the First World War as well. Just like the 1888 commission rifle that we talked about earlier, they were meant to be rear-line rifles, but when push comes to shove, which often happened in the First World War, you put those old rifles back into service without too much thought. This rifle would have originally been created as a model 1888, which fired a black powder cartridge, but it was a small bore 8mm black powder cartridge, which was pretty modern for the time, but not quite modern enough. Soon after, a semi-smokeless powder cartridge was adopted. It was still a bottlenose round in 8mm, but the new powder pumped up the velocity a good deal, so these rifles were retrofitted with updated sight graduations. There was an even later 8x50R cartridge that was completely smokeless, and this rifle will technically fire that cartridge, but the older wedge locking system of this rifle is not really meant to handle those kind of pressures, so it isn't recommended to fire a lot of that fully smokeless cartridge in these old rifles. Like all your Mannlicher rifle designs, this is a straight pull action. So this bolt comes straight to the rear and goes straight forward to chamber a cartridge. It is loaded with 5-round M-block clips that fit straight down into the receiver, just as we discussed with the 1888 commission rifle. And it's actually the only rifle that we'll be talking about today that came with a really nice partial pistol grip, which was a very modern feature for the times of this rifle. The 1888 and 1888-90 rifles are very long and tall, which leads to them being pretty heavy, but they are pretty thin and sleek. Really a fairly elegant weapon for the late 1880s and early 1890s. Moving back in time another year, we have my 1890 manufactured 1886 Lebel rifle. This is one of the most famous and important military arms ever devised. It is a super steampunky marvel of innovation, an awesome mix of old and new, and although it was the most advanced rifle in the world upon its adoption, it was also edging on obsolescence at the exact same time. Now, my example here of the 1886 Lebel does have the M93 update. The Lebel rifle is chambered in 8x51 Lebel. This is a bolt-action repeating rifle, but it is fed from a shotgun-like tube magazine that runs under the barrel of the rifle. That tube does hold 8 rounds, which was a substantial round count for the time that this rifle was put into service, but it is very fiddly to reload when compared to its more elegant contemporaries that use proper packet and clip loading. The action is essentially from a Kropatschek, but the big innovation with the Lebel rifle is the chambering. That 8x51mm cartridge that the French adopted fired purely smokeless powder, giving this rifle an advantage over any other fielded during the time this rifle was adopted. That smokeless powder cartridge greatly increased velocities over previous black powder cartridges, allowing a soldier to make hits at much further distances, and being smokeless also came with the added bonus of not blowing this giant cloud of smoke that disrupts your vision between shots. The 1886 Lebel would go on to be France's primary infantry arm during the First World War, and by that time, some of the older features of this rifle had really caught up to it, making it more of a dinosaur on those World War I battlefields. With that said, these are still very capable rifles in the right hands, although they are large and cumbersome, and reloading does leave something to be desired. We are keeping it in France for the fourth spot on my list. This is a relatively recent acquisition for my reference collection, and is actually the only fully black powder firing rifle that I have in the collection, period. This is a French 1874 Gras carbine with the M80 update. I picked this rifle up on a flash sale from Royal Tiger Imports for a very reasonable price. Since this is coming from the Ethiopian horde though, it is missing the rear sight. Most of the Gras rifles that Royal Tiger Imports has is missing the rear sight, and the overall condition is not beautiful, but it could also be a lot worse. All things considered, this is actually in pretty good shape. The 1874 Gras is a bolt-action rifle, but unlike the other rifles that we've talked about so far, this is a single-shot rifle. So for every action of the bolt, you have to place a new cartridge in the rifle in order to fire once more. The Gras was initially, for all intents and purposes, just an updated chassepot. The chassepot was a needle-fire rifle, and the Gras is a centerfire metallic cartridge rifle, although still in that big bore 11mm black powder chambering. There are several varieties of Gras rifles, both long rifles and carbines. My particular example is a carbine, and it is a cavalry carbine. We can ascertain that because there is no bayonet attachment method on the end of the barrel here. Rifles issued to cavalry were not issued with bayonets. I'd really like to get my hands on some 11mm Gras one of these days to actually send a couple rounds down range with this rifle. But whether or not that'll happen, who knows? There were actually some Gras rifles that were updated in a later conversion to fire the 8mm Lebel cartridge. Of course, the action, the bolt, and the receiver of this rifle was designed for the pressures that go with black powder cartridges, and those smokeless powder 8mm Lebel cartridges were screaming hot in comparison, so these rifles are not really meant to fire that ammo. It just wouldn't be good for the longevity of the action. It would be very cool to add one of those to the collection though. And the oldest rifle in my collection, which also happens to be the longest rifle in my collection, is coming to us from Italy. This is a Vetterli 1870-87-15 that was made at the Torino Arsenal way back in 1873. These Vetterli rifles are fascinating in my opinion because they underwent so many conversions. This rifle would have originally been designed as a single shot bolt action black powder rifle. Those were later updated to the 1887 pattern, which was a packet fed repeating black powder cartridge firing rifle. And again, these rifles underwent an update where they were converted over to a Mannlicher style clip loading system and rechambered to the 6.5 by 52 Carcano cartridge, which was smokeless. Now, I will start out by giving you guys a warning. If you have one of these rifles and it's converted to 6.5 Carcano, I certainly don't recommend shooting it. That point was really hit home by seeing Arsenal. They managed to pop 2 of these rifles. The only way that this super old Vetterli action can safely fire those 6.5 Carcano rounds is if you do an extreme download, and that is something that would need to be done by a very experienced hand loader. Shooting factory 6.5 Carcano in these could lead to serious injury or death, and it would be even more likely that your rifle wouldn't survive. Just on looks alone, this is one of the most interesting steampunky looking rifles I've ever come across. I love fondling this very unique bolt action that it has. You can very clearly see where it underwent its old conversions with the wood plugs they had to insert into the magazine well to fit the Mannlicher style magazine of the Carcano. Italy really did everything they could to keep this super old rifle in service as long as possible, and that's one of my favorite aspects of Milsurp collecting. Few things are cooler to me than a military rifle that underwent many different changes to prolong its service life. The conversion that the barrels went under to size them down from that big bore black powder cartridge to the quite small diameter 6.5mm cartridge is pretty interesting. It's actually a 6.5 bored sleeve that was inserted into that older barrel. And for this particular example, I do have the correct bayonet that goes along with it. Now, it's not a serial number matching bayonet, but it does still have the sheath, and it was made at the same arsenal, Torino. This is an 1870 Vetterli bayonet that, along with the rifles, was converted leading up to World War I. Originally, the blade on this bayonet would have been much longer. By the time the early 1900s rolled around, militaries around the world were realizing that you didn't need such a crazy sword bayonet, and that a knife-sized bayonet will do just fine. The guards were also modified, but that slides on just perfectly. Kind of sits off to the side, which is definitely an old school feature. The majority of my collection is centered around centerfire, metallic cartridge, smokeless powder rifles. And so I don't have that many truly old school milsurps. There are some rifles that are very high on my list that I would like to add to the collection though. Right off the top of my head, the Long Lee or Lee Metford is certainly one I'd like to add to the collection. A US Krag rifle is one that I absolutely have to attain at some point. And I really like the Japanese Marauder rifles, but those are so expensive I doubt I'll ever be able to obtain one of those. That about does it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, or at the very least found it mildly entertaining or informative. If you did, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. That really helps it out with that Google algorithm and getting it distributed out to other viewers. Subscribe to the channel to catch all of my future military surplus firearms content. Let me know what your oldest firearms are down in the comments and what you thought about the video. I will catch you guys in the next video. See you then. Peace.